Hi friends, welcome back. It's Christina, the manager of the Pacific Beach Library. Today is day 10 and we're continuing to read Wuthering Heights, and I forgot to flip the way the thing looks on my screen, so it's backwards. How exciting. Let's stop looking at words then so we won't notice it as much. Hi, the tea that I'm enjoying today is the Blue Lady Grey, just because I thought it sounded kind of fun for today. It's a little bit gray outside. I thought a gray tea just felt right. But hello! It's a sunnier day when we get to read together, so thank you very much for those of you who are here to read in together with me. I appreciate it. I enjoy it so much. Let's see. Ooh, yesterday we had a great chapter. Today we have 3 more good ones coming up. This book is really moving along fast. I am curious too about what that adaptation of the film we're going to watch at the end of the month will be like if it'll really cover so I think I've heard that some of the adaptations only cover pretty much the first section, like pretty much a little bit past Cathy's death. And we've got almost half the book yet to go. And so there's a lot more to come. We'll find out what happens. And also just one quick reminder from me too, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have not yet signed up for the Count of Monte Cristo tea/brunch that we're going to do next Friday, the 21st of May at 10:30 per Alexander Dumas. If you have not yet RSVP'd and you know that you want to go, please do RSVP as going, so that way I can send your tea out to the nearest location to you, the nearest San Diego Public Library, to where you like to go check out your books, and that way we can have that opportunity to drink the same tea together next Friday. All right, so let's talk about yesterday's reading. Whew, it was just one chapter and it was so much going on in it. Okay, so it started out in the aftermath of Cathy's death. And somebody comes in while Nellie is trying to take care of the little baby. And that somebody is Isabella Linton Heathcliff. And basically she has escaped from her husband in Wuthering Heights. And she tells the story of basically how in the aftermath of Cathy's funeral, Hindley had planned on going to Cathy's funeral, but then he got himself into a drunken stupor and he didn't end up going. Afterwards, he was feeling upset about everything, and he decided that he was once and for all going to kill Heathcliff. And much though she wanted to see Heathcliff die, she didn't want him to die quite that way. So she's like, she warns him that Hindley's going to kill him. So Hindley's a little mad that he doesn't have the element of surprise. Heathcliff's a little mad, like, why did you bother wasting my time? You know, it's not going to manage to kill me anyway. And so then she's like, all right, my conscience is clean. I've done what I can do. And then there's like this fight where basically Hindley tries to kill Heathcliff, but of course he doesn't succeed. And when he stabs with the, he has a gun with a blade attached to it. I picture it sort of like a bayonet attached to an old gun. But he tries to attack Heathcliff, and Heathcliff manages to turn the blade back onto Hindley and cuts up his arm, and it's terrible. And then after Hindley passes out, he kicks him and beats him, and it's terrible. And Joseph, the servant, thinks that Heathcliff may actually have murdered Hindley. And of course that actually isn't the case. I mean, Heathcliff, as bad as he is, has not done that yet. And so Heathcliff is able to convince Joseph that he did not murder Hindley Earnshaw. And Isabella, even though she just loathes her husband, she does confirm his account that Hindley had tried to attack Heathcliff and Heathcliff was defending himself. And in fact, they were able to kind of nurse Hindley back. And the next morning, when Isabella comes down to breakfast, she sees Heathcliff like fighting off tears and Hindley sort of staring into space. And she decides, of course, to goad them. And so she goads them, and let me go back. Sorry, I was skipping ahead a little bit. She goads them, and she is able finally, like she says how she reveals to Hindley that Heathcliff had actually beaten him while he was unconscious. And she goads them by saying things to Heathcliff basically about how he didn't really love her enough. And it gets pretty bad. Eventually, he's so upset that they are, there's a fight going on, and she's able to get out. And so she escapes from Wuthering Heights. She runs off to the Grange. She says, though, that she cannot stay at the Grange because it wouldn't be safe, because she knows that Heathcliff would come after her and try to destroy any happiness she could ever have. And so her only hope is to stay out of his sight and hopefully out of his mind. And so she ends up moving away near London. She actually has a son a few months afterwards. And so that is the young Mr. Heathcliff, who we know is likely at some point to marry young Catherine Linton. First cousins, ew. But still, this is a different time. Okay. And so she has this child, Linton, and from the first reported him to be an ailing, peevish creature. Now, Heathcliff does find out eventually where Isabella's living, and he finds out too that he has a child, but he's sort of willing to not pursue it. A while afterwards, they find out too that, oh, by the way, she mentioned something again interesting about names. Just as Isabella has chosen to name her child Linton to, I think, to disavow his connection to the Heathcliff family as much as she can, even though his name is Linton Heathcliff. We know too that Catherine's daughter, the one that was born in, she lived only 2 hours before, Cathy only lived 2 hours after the child's birth, before she herself expired, that they named the daughter Catherine. So now this child is Catherine Linton. And it's interesting because the father, Edgar, never calls it the name in full. He always calls his daughter Cathy, just as he had never called the first Catherine Cathy. So let's just get this straight here. The first one, the mother, is the one that everyone, like Heathcliff and Nellie and her family, they all called her Cathy, but her husband called her Catherine. The daughter is the one that everyone else in the story is going to call Catherine, but he, the father, or Edgar Linton, will call her Cathy, just to make it extra confusing for us as to which Cathy Linton they're talking about, or which Catherine Linton they're talking about. Oh my goodness. Okay, so yeah, the daughter is Catherine Linton, but the father, Edgar, will call her Cathy. Okay, just so confusing. All right, then Nellie says how they hear from Dr. Kenneth that Hindley Earnshaw has died. Basically, he pretty much drank himself to death, although when he was still slightly alive, I know, it's confusing, the names, right? It's when the Heathcliff sent Joseph away to check on, to get the doctor, and they do actually reveal that perhaps, he was still alive just a little bit, and he was dead by the time Joseph came back with the doctor. So there's a little bit of suspicion on Joseph's part that maybe Hindley might have survived without the assistance of Heathcliff, so ambiguous. But Heathcliff is not blamed in the death, officially. So what we discover too, though, upon the death of Hindley is that he had mortgaged the entire Wuthering Heights estate, that after the death of his wife, he had become not only an open drunkard, but a gambler, and he was unable to stop. And in so doing, over time, he had mortgaged everything over to Heathcliff. So Heathcliff, going from being like a beggar taken in off the street and treated as the lowest servant by Hindley, is now the owner of Wuthering Heights. And Hareton, who otherwise would have been like the local lord of the manor and one of the more wealthy men in the region, is now himself a servant on this estate, owned now by Heathcliff, the former servant of the estate. So interesting things happen there too. By the way, Nellie also makes an observation about how it's interesting, the parallel of what we see with these two children, that like we're about to see things going on with with Linton Heathcliff and Catherine Linton. But before them, their parents, we see how the different fathers responded to the death of their beloved wives. Hindley Earnshaw, when his wife passed away, he fell apart. He became a drunkard. He was unable, even though he loved his son, to have much to do with his son. It was too painful, and he just sort of ignores him. Versus we see Edgar Linton, who, responding to the death of his wife, he does shrink away from the world a little bit. He stops being the local magistrate. He basically becomes a hermit on Thrushcross Grange, but he devotes himself to his daughter, and he loves her so much, and he trusts. And the way that Nellie attributes the difference is that Edgar Linton chose to trust in God versus Hindley did not. And so that's why, just only able to see what was around him, he couldn't cope with the loss of his wife. Okay, so Today we have 3 short chapters. Ding! It's so exciting. All right, so we're going to go ahead and continue with Wuthering Heights, chapters 18 through 20. Let's go ahead and get started with chapter 18 of Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. The 12 years, continued Mrs. Dean, following that dismal period, were the happiest of my life. My greatest troubles in their passage rose from our little lady's trifling illnesses, which she had to experience in common with all children, rich and poor. For the rest, after the first 6 months, she grew like a larch and could walk and talk too, in her own way, before the heath blossomed a second time over Mrs. Linton's dust. She was the most winning thing that ever brought sunshine into a desolate house. A real beauty in face, with the Earnshaw's handsome dark eyes, but the Linton's fair skin and small features and yellow curling hair. Her spirit was high, though not rough, and qualified by a heart sensitive and lively to excess in its affections. That capacity for intense attachments reminded me of her mother. Still, she did not resemble her, for she could be soft and mild as a dove, and she had a gentle voice and pensive expression. Her anger was never furious. Her love never fierce. It was deep and tender. However, it must be acknowledged, she had faults to foil her gifts. A propensity to be saucy was one, and a perverse will that indulged children invariably acquire, whether they be good-tempered or cross. If a servant chanced to vex her, it was always, "I shall tell papa," and if he reproved her, even by a look, you would have thought it a heartbreaking business. I don't believe he ever did speak a harsh word to her. He took her education entirely on himself and made it an amusement. Fortunately, curiosity and a quick intellect urged her into an apt scholar. She learned rapidly and eagerly and did honor to his teaching. Till she reached the age of 13, she had not once been beyond the range of the park by herself. Mr. Linton would take her with him a mile or so outside on rare occasions, but he trusted her to no one else. Gimmerton was an unsubstantial name in her ears. The chapel, the only building she had approached or entered, except her own home. Wuthering Heights and Mr. Heathcliff did not exist for her. She was a perfect recluse, and apparently perfectly contented. Sometimes, indeed, while surveying the country from her nursery window, she would observe, "Ellen, how long will it be before I can walk to the top of those hills? I wonder what lies on the other side. Is it the sea?" "No, Miss Cathy," I would answer. "It is hills again, just like these." "And what are those golden rocks like when you stand under them?" she once asked. The abrupt descent of Penistone Crags particularly attracted her notice, especially when the setting sun shone on it, and the topmost heights and the whole extent of landscape besides lay in shadow. I explained that they were bare masses of stone, with hardly enough earth in their clefts to nourish a stunted tree. "And why are they bright so long after it is evening here?" she pursued. "Because they are a great deal higher up than we are," replied I. "You could not climb them. They are too high and steep. In winter the frost is always there before it comes to us, and deep into summer I have found snow under that black hollow on the northeast side." "Oh, you have been on them!" she cried gleefully. "Then I can go too when I am a woman. Has Papa been, Ellen?" "Papa would tell you, miss," I answered hastily, "that they are not worth the trouble of visiting. The moors, where you ramble with him, are much nicer, and Thrushcross Park is the finest place in the world." "But I know the park, and I don't know those," she murmured to herself, "and I should delight to look round me from the brow of that tallest point. My little pony Minnie shall take me sometime." One of the maids mentioning the fairy cave quite turned her head with a desire to fulfill this project. She teased Mr. Linton about it, and he promised she should have the journey when she got older. But Miss Catherine measured her age by months, and, "Now, am I old enough to go to Penistone Crags?" was the constant question in her mouth. The road thither wound close by Wuthering Heights. Edgar had not the heart to pass it, so she received as constantly the answer, "Not yet, love, not yet." I said Mrs. Heathcliff lived above a dozen years after quitting her husband. Her family were of a delicate constitution. She and Edgar both lacked the ruddy health that you will generally meet in these parts. What her last illness was, I am not certain. I conjecture they died of the same thing, a kind of fever, slow at its commencement, but incurable, and rapidly consuming life towards the close. She wrote to inform her brother of the probable conclusion of a 4 months' indisposition under which she had suffered, and entreated him to come to her, if possible, for she had much to settle, and she wished to bid him adieu and deliver Linton safely into his hands. Her hope was that Linton might be left with him, as he had been with her, his father. As he had been with her. His father, she would fain convince herself, had no desire to assume the burden of his maintenance or education. My master hesitated not a moment in complying with her request. Reluctant as he was to leave home on ordinary calls, he flew to answer this, commending Catherine to my peculiar vigilance in his absence, with reiterated orders that she must not wander out of the park, even under my escort. He did not calculate on her going unaccompanied. He was away 3 weeks. The first day or two, my charge sat in a corner of the library, too sad for either reading or playing. In that quiet state she caused me little trouble, but it was succeeded by an interval of impatient, fretful weariness, and, being too busy and too old then to run up and down amusing her, I hit on a method by which she might entertain herself. I used to send her on travels round the grounds, now on foot and now on a pony, indulging her with a patient audience of all her real and imaginary adventures when she returned. The summer shone in full prime, and she took such a taste for the solitary rambling that she often contrived to remain out from breakfast till tea, and then the evenings were spent in recounting her fanciful tales. I did not fear her breaking bounds, because the gates were generally locked, and I thought she would scarcely venture forth alone if they had stood wide open. Unluckily, my confidence proved misplaced. Catherine came to me one morning at 8 o'clock and said she was that day an Arabian merchant going to cross the desert with his caravan, and I must give her plenty of provision for herself and beasts, a horse and 3 camels, personated by a large hound and a couple of pointers. I got together good store of dainties and slung them in a basket on one side of the saddle, and she sprang up as gay as a fairy, sheltered by her wide-brimmed hat and gauze veil from the July sun, and trotted off with a merry laugh, mocking my cautious counsel to avoid galloping and come back early. The naughty thing never made her appearance at tea. One traveler, the hound, being an old dog and fond of its ease, returned, but neither Cathy nor the pony nor the 2 pointers were visible in any direction, and I dispatched emissaries down this path and that path, and at last went wandering in search of her myself. There was a laborer working at a fence round a plantation on the borders of the grounds. I inquired of him if he had seen our young lady. "I saw her at morn," he replied. "She would have me to cut her a hazel switch, and then she leapt her galloway over the hedge yonder, where it is lowest, and galloped out of sight." You may guess how I felt at hearing this news. It struck me directly she must have started for Penistone Crags. "What will become of her?" I ejaculated, pushing through a gap which the man was repairing, and making straight to the high road. I walked as if for a wager, mile after mile, till a turn brought me in view of the heights, but no Catherine could I detect, far or near. The Crags lie about 1.5 miles beyond Mr. Heathcliff's place, and that is 4 from the Grange, so I began to fear night would fall ere I could reach them. And what if she should have slipped in clambering among them, I reflected, and been killed, or broken some of her bones? My suspense was truly painful, and at first it gave me delightful relief to observe, in hurrying by the farmhouse, Charlie, the fiercest of the pointers, lying under a window with swelled head and bleeding ear. I opened the wicket and ran to the door, knocking vehemently for admittance. A woman whom I knew, and who formerly lived at Gimmerton, answered. She had been servant there since the death of Mr. Earnshaw. "Ah," said she, "you are come a-seeking your little mistress. Don't be frightened. She's here safe, but I'm glad it isn't the master." "He is not at home, then, is he?" I panted, quite breathless with quick walking and alarm. "No, no," she replied. "Both he and Joseph are off, and I think they won't return this hour or more. Step in and rest you a bit." I entered and beheld my stray lamb seated on the hearth, rocking herself in a little chair that had been her mother's when a child. Her hat was hung against the wall, and she seemed perfectly at home, laughing and chattering in the best spirits imaginable to Hareton, now a great strong lad of 18, who stared at her with considerable curiosity and astonishment, comprehending precious little of the fluent succession of remarks and questions which her tongue never ceased pouring forth. Very well, miss, I exclaimed, concealing my joy under an angry countenance. This is your last ride till Papa comes back. I'll not trust you over the threshold again, you naughty, naughty girl. Aha, Ellen, she cried gaily, jumping up and running to my side. I shall have a pretty story to tell tonight, and so you've found me out. Have you ever been here in your life before? Put that hat on and home at once, said I. I'm dreadfully grieved at you, Miss Cathy. You've done extremely wrong. It's no use pouting and crying. That won't repay the trouble I've had scouring the country after you. To think how Mr. Linton charged me to keep you in, and you stealing off so. It shows you are a cunning little fox, and nobody will put faith in you any more. What have I done? Sobbed she, instantly checked. Papa charged me nothing. He'll not scold me, Ellen. He's never cross, like you. Come, come, I repeated. I'll tie the riband. Now let us have no petulance. Oh, for shame. You, 13 years old, and such a baby. This exclamation was caused by her pushing the hat from her head and retreating to the chimney out of my reach. Nay, said the servant, don't be hard on the bonny lass, Mrs. Dean. We made her stop. She'd fain have ridden forwards, afeard you should be uneasy, but Hareton offered to go with her, and I thought he should. It's a wild road over the hills. Hareton, during the discussion, stood with his hands in his pockets, too awkward to speak, though he looked as if he did not relish my intrusion. How long am I to wait? I continued, disregarding the woman's interference. It will be dark in 10 minutes. Where is the pony, Miss Cathy? And where is Phoenix? I shall leave you unless you be quick. So please yourself. The pony is in the yard, she replied, and Phoenix is shut in there. He's bitten, and so is Charlie. I was going to tell you all about it, but you are in a bad temper and don't deserve to hear. I picked up her hat and approached to reinstate it, but perceiving that the people of the house took her part, she commenced capering around the room, and on my giving chase, ran like a mouse over and under and behind the furniture, rendering it ridiculous for me to pursue. Hareton and the woman laughed, and she joined them, and waxed more impertinent still, till I cried in great irritation, Well, Miss Cathy, if you were aware whose house this is, you'd be glad enough to get out. It is your father's, isn't it? Said she, turning to Hareton. Nay, he replied, looking down and blushing bashfully. He could not stand a steady gaze from her eyes, though they were just his own. Whose then? Your master's? She asked. He colored deeper, with a different feeling, muttered an oath, and turned away. Who is his master? Continued the tiresome girl, appealing to me. He talked about our house and our folk. I thought he had been the owner's son. And he never said, miss. He should have done, shouldn't he, if he's a servant? Hareton grew black as a thundercloud at this childish speech. I silently shook my questioner, and at last succeeded in equipping her for departure. Now, get my horse, she said, addressing her unknown kinsman as she would one of the stable boys at the Grange, and you may come with me. I want to see where the goblin hunter rises in the marsh, and to hear about the farishes, as you call them. But make haste. What's the matter? Get my horse, I say. I'll see thee damned before I be thy servant, growled the lad. You'll see me what? Asked Catherine in surprise. Damned, thou saucy wench, or witch, he replied. There, Miss Cathy, you see you have got into pretty company, I interposed. Nice words to be used to a young lady. Pray don't begin to dispute with him. Come, let us seek for Minnie ourselves, and be gone. But Ellen, cried she, staring, fixed in astonishment, how dare he speak so to me? Mustn't he be made to do as I ask him? You wicked creature, I shall tell Papa what you said. Now then. Hareton did not appear to feel this threat, so the tears sprung into her eyes with indignation. You bring the pony, she exclaimed, turning to the woman, and let my dog free this moment. Softly, miss, answered the addressed. You'll lose nothing by being civil. Though Mr. Hareton there be not the master's son, he's your cousin, and I was never hired to serve you. He? My cousin? Cried Cathy with a scornful laugh. Yes, indeed, responded her reprover. Oh, Ellen, don't let them say such things, she pursued in great trouble. Papa's gone to fetch my cousin from London. My cousin is a gentleman's son. That my... She stopped and wept outright, upset at the bare notion of relationship with such a clown. Oh, that my... There we go. Hush, hush, I whispered. People can have many cousins and of all sorts, Miss Cathy, without being any the worse for it, only they needn't keep their company if they be disagreeable and bad. He's not my cousin, Ellen, she went on, gathering fresh grief from reflections and flinging herself into my arms for refuge from the idea. I was much vexed at her and the servant for their mutual revelations, having no doubt of Linton's approaching arrival, communicated by the former, being reported to Mr. Heathcliff, and feeling as confident that Catherine's first thought on her father's return would be to seek an explanation of the latter's assertion concerning her rude-bred kindred. Hareton, recovering from his disgust at being taken for a servant, seemed moved by her distress, and having fetched the pony round to the door, he took, to propitiate her, a fine crooked-legged terrier whelp from the kennel, and putting it into her hand, bid her wished, for he meant naught. Pausing in her lamentations, she surveyed him with a glance of awe and horror, then burst forth anew. I could scarcely refrain from smiling at this antipathy to the poor fellow, who was a well-made, athletic youth, good-looking in features, and stout and healthy, but attired in garments befitting his daily occupations of working on the farm and lounging among the moors after rabbits and game. Still, I thought I could detect in his physiognomy a mind owning better qualities than his father ever possessed. Good things lost amid a wilderness of weeds, to be sure, whose rankness far overtopped their neglected growth. Yet, notwithstanding, evidence of a wealthy soil that might yield luxuriant crops under other and favorable circumstances. Mr. Heathcliff, I believe, had not treated him physically ill, thanks to his fearless nature, which offered no temptation to that course of oppression. It had none of the timid susceptibility that would have given zeal to ill treatment, in Heathcliff's judgment. He appeared to have bent his malevolence on making him a brute. He was never taught to read or write, never rebuked for any bad habit which did not annoy his keeper, never led a single step towards virtue, or guarded by a single precept against vice. And from what I heard, Joseph contributed much to his deterioration by a narrow-minded partiality which prompted him to flatter and pet him as a boy, because he was the head of the old family. And as he had been in the habit of accusing Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff, when children, of putting the master past his patience, and compelling him to seek solace in drink by what he termed their offald ways, so at present he laid the whole burden of Hareton's faults on the shoulders of the usurper of his property. If the lad swore, he wouldn't correct him, nor however culpably he behaved. It gave Joseph satisfaction, apparently, to watch him go the worst lengths. He allowed that he was ruined, that his soul was abandoned to perdition, but then he reflected that Heathcliff must answer for it. Hareton's blood would be required at his hands, and there lay immense consolation in that thought. Joseph had instilled into him a pride of name and of his lineage. He would, had he dared, have fostered hate between him and the present owner of the Heights, but his dread of that owner amounted to superstition, and he confined his feelings regarding him to muttered innuendos and private combinations. I don't pretend to be intimately acquainted with the mode of living customary in those days at Wuthering Heights. I only speak from hearsay, for I saw little. The villagers affirmed Mr. Heathcliff was near and a cruel, hard landlord to his tenants. But the house itself had regained its ancient aspect of comfort under female management, and the scenes of riot common in Hindley's time were not now enacted within its walls. The master was too gloomy to seek companionship with any people, good or bad, and he is yet. This, however, is not making progress with my story. Miss Cathy rejected the peace offering of the terrier and demanded her own dogs, Charlie and Phoenix. They came limping and hanging their heads, and we set out for home, sadly out of sorts, every one of us. I could not wring from my little lady how she had spent the day, except that, as I supposed, the goal of her pilgrimage was Penistone Crags, and she arrived without adventure to the gate of the farmhouse when Hareton happened to issue forth, attended by some canine followers who attacked her train. They had a smart battle before their owners could separate them. That formed an introduction. Catherine told Hareton who she was and where she was going, and asked him to show her the way, finally beguiling him to accompany her. He opened the mysteries of the fairy cave and 20 other queer places. But, Being in disgrace, I was not favored with the description of the interesting object she saw. I could gather, however, that her guide had been a favorite, till she hurt his feelings by addressing him as a servant, and Heathcliff's housekeeper hurt his by calling him her cousin. Then the language he had held to her rankled in her heart. She who was always love and darling and queen and angel with everybody at the Grange, to be insulted so shockingly by a stranger. She did not comprehend it, and hard work I had to obtain a promise that she would not lay the grievance before her father. I explained how he objected to the whole household at the Heights, and how sorry he would be to find she had been there. But I insisted most on the fact that if she revealed my negligence of his orders, he would perhaps be so angry that I should have to leave. And Cathy couldn't bear that prospect. She pledged her word and kept it, for my sake. After all, she was a sweet little girl. And now chapter 19. A letter, edged with black, announced the day of my master's return. Isabella was dead, and he wrote to bid me get mourning for his daughter and arrange a room and other accommodations for his youthful nephew. Catherine ran wild with joy at the idea of welcoming her father back, and indulged most sanguine anticipations of the innumerable excellences of her real cousin. The evening of their expected arrival came. Since early morning she had been busy ordering her own small affairs, and now, attired in her new black frock, poor thing, her aunt's death impressed her with no definite sorrow. She obliged me by constant worrying to walk with her down through the grounds to meet them. Linton is just 6 months younger than I am, she chattered as we strolled leisurely over the swells and hollows of mossy turf under shadows of the trees. How delightful it will be to have him for a playfellow. Aunt Isabella sent Papa a beautiful lock of his hair. It was lighter than mine, more flaxen and quite as fine. I have it carefully preserved in a little glass box, and I've often thought what pleasure it would be to see its owner. Oh, I am happy. And Papa, dear, dear Papa! Come, Ellen, let us run! Come, run! She ran, and returned, and ran again, many times before my sober footsteps reached the gate, and then she seated herself on the grassy bank beside the path and tried to wait patiently. But that was impossible. She couldn't be still a minute. How long they are, she exclaimed. Ah, I see some dust on the road. They are coming. No. When will they be here? May we not go a little way? Half a mile, Ellen, only just half a mile. Do say yes, to that clump of birches at the turn. I refused staunchly, and at length her suspense was ended. The traveling carriage rolled in sight. Miss Cathy shrieked and stretched out her arms as soon as she caught her father's face looking from the window. He descended, nearly as eager as herself, and a considerable interval elapsed ere they had a thought to spare for any but themselves. While they exchanged caresses, I took a peep in to see after Linton. He was asleep in a corner, wrapped in a warm, fur-lined cloak, as if it had been winter. A pale, delicate, effeminate boy who might have been taken for my master's younger brother, so strong was the resemblance. But there was a sickly peevishness in his aspect that Edgar Linton never had. The latter saw me looking, and having shaken hands, advised me to close the door and leave him undisturbed, for the journey had fatigued him. Cathy would fain have taken one glance, but her father told her to come on, and they walked together up the park, while I hastened before to prepare the servants. Now, darling, said Mr. Linton, addressing his daughter, as they halted at the bottom of the front steps, your cousin is not so strong or so merry as you are, and he has lost his mother, remember, a very short time since. Therefore, don't expect him to play and run about with you directly, and don't harass him much by talking. Let him be quiet this evening at least, will you? Yes, yes, Papa, answered Catherine, but I do want to see him, and he hasn't once looked out. The carriage stopped, and the sleeper, being roused, was lifted to the ground by his uncle. This is your cousin Cathy, Linton, he said, putting their little hands together. She's fond of you already, and mind you don't grieve her by crying tonight. Try to be cheerful now. The traveling is at an end, and you have nothing to do but rest and amuse yourself as you please. Let me go to bed, then, answered the boy, shrinking from Catherine's salute, and he put his fingers to his eyes to remove incipient tears. Come, come, there's a good child, I whispered, leading him in. You'll make her weep too. See how sorry she is for you. I do not know whether it were sorrow for him, but his cousin put on as sad a countenance as himself, and returned to her father. All three entered and mounted to the library, where tea was laid ready. I proceeded to remove Linton's cap and mantle, and placed him on a chair by the table, but he was no sooner seated than he began to cry afresh. My master inquired what was the matter. "I can't sit on a chair," sobbed the boy. "Go to the sofa then, and Ellen shall bring you some tea," answered his uncle patiently. He had been greatly tried during the journey, I felt convinced, by his fretful, ailing charge. Linton slowly trailed himself off and lay down. Cathy carried a footstool and her cup to his side. At first she sat silent, but that could not last. She had resolved to make a pet of her little cousin, as she would have him to be, and she commenced stroking his curls and kissing his cheek and offering him tea in her saucer, like a baby. This pleased him, for he was not much better. He dried his eyes and lightened into a faint smile. "Oh, he'll do very well," said the master to me, after watching them a minute. "Very well, if we can keep him, Ellen. The company of a child of his own age will instill new spirit into him soon, and by wishing for strength, he'll gain it." "Aye, if we can keep him," I mused to myself, and sore misgivings came over me that there was slight hope of that. And then I thought, however will that weakling live at Wuthering Heights, between his father and Hareton? What playmates and instructors they'll be! Our doubts were presently decided, even earlier than I expected. I had just taken the children upstairs after tea was finished and seen Linton asleep. He would not suffer me to leave him till that was the case. I had come down and was standing by the table in the hall, lighting a bedroom candle for Mr. Edgar, when a maid stepped out of the kitchen and informed me that Mr. Heathcliff's servant, Joseph, was at the door and wished to speak with the master. "I shall ask him what he wants first," I said in considerable trepidation. "A very unlikely hour to be troubling people, and the instant they have returned from a long journey. I don't think the master can see him." Joseph had advanced to the kitchen as I uttered these words, and now presented himself in the hall. He was donned in his Sunday garments, with his most sanctimonious and sourest face, and holding his hat in one hand and his stick in the other, he proceeded to clean his shoes on the mat. "Good evening, Joseph," I said coldly. "What business brings you here tonight?" "It's Maister Linton I mun speak till," he answered, waving me disdainfully aside. "Mr. Linton is going to bed. Unless you have something particular to say, I'm sure he won't hear it now," I continued. "You had better sit down in there and entrust your message to me." "Which is his room?" pursued the fellow, surveying the range of closed doors. I perceived he was bent on refusing my mediation, so very reluctantly I went up to the library and announced the unseasonable visitor, advising that he should be dismissed till next day. Mr. Linton had no time to empower me to do so, for he mounted close at my heels, and pushing into the apartment, planted himself at the far side of the table, with his two fists clapped on the head of his stick, and began in an elevated tone, as if anticipating opposition. "Heathcliff has sent me for his lad, and I mun't go back bout him. Edgar Linton was silent a minute. An expression of exceeding sorrow overcast his features. He would have pitied the child on his own account, but, recalling Isabella's hopes and fears, and anxious wishes for her son, and her commendations of him to his care, he grieved bitterly at the prospect of yielding him up, and searched in his heart how it might be avoided. No plan offered itself. The very exhibition of any desire to keep him would have rendered the claimant more peremptory. There was nothing left but to resign him. However, he was not going to rouse him from his sleep. "Tell Mr. Heathcliff," he answered calmly, "that his son shall come to Wuthering Heights tomorrow. He is in bed and too tired to go the distance now. You may also tell him that the mother of Linton desired him to remain under my guardianship, and at present his health is very precarious." "No," said Joseph, giving a thud with his prop on the floor and assuming an authoritative air. "No, that manners not. Heathcliff makes no account o' t' mother, nor ya norther, but he'll have his lad, and I mun take him. So now, you know." "You shall not tonight," answered Linton decisively. "Walk downstairs at once and repeat to your master what I have said. Ellen, show him down. Go." and avoiding the indignant elder with a lift by the arm, he rid the room of him and closed the door. "Vera will," shouted Joseph as he slowly drew off. "To morn he's come himself and thrust him out, if ye dar." Chapter 20. To obviate the danger of this threat being fulfilled, Mr. Linton commissioned me to take the boy home early on Catherine's pony, and, said he, "As we shall now have no influence over his destiny, good or bad, you must say nothing of where he has gone to my daughter. She cannot associate with him hereafter, and it is better for her to remain in ignorance of his proximity, lest she should be restless and anxious to visit the Heights. Merely tell her his father sent for him suddenly, and he has been obliged to leave us." Linton was very reluctant to be roused from his bed at 5 o'clock, and astonished to be informed that we must prepare for further traveling. But I softened off the matter by stating that he was going to spend some time with his father, Mr. Heathcliff, who wished to see him so much he did not like to defer the pleasure till he should recover from his late journey. "My father!" he cried in strange perplexity. "Mamma never told me I had a father. Where does he live? I'd rather stay with uncle." "He lives a little distance from the Grange," I replied, "just beyond those hills. Not so far, but you may walk over here when you get hearty, and you should be glad to go home and to see him. You must try to love him as you did your mother, and then he will love you." "But why have I not heard of him before?" asked Linton. "Why didn't Mamma and he live together, as other people do?" "He had business to keep him in the north," I answered, "and your mother's health required her to reside in the south." "And why didn't Mamma speak to me about him?" persevered the child. "She often talked of uncle, and I learnt to love him long ago. How am I to love Papa? I don't know him." "Oh, all children love their parents," I said. "Your mother perhaps thought you would want to be with him if she mentioned him often to you. Let us make haste. An early ride on such a beautiful morning is much preferable to an hour's more sleep." "Is she to go with us?" he demanded. "The little girl I saw yesterday?" "Not now," replied I. "Is uncle?" he continued. "No, I shall be your companion there," I said. Linton sank back on his pillow and fell into a brown study. "I won't go without uncle," he cried at length. "I can't tell where you mean to take me." I attempted to persuade him of his naughtiness, of showing reluctance to meet his father. Still, he obstinately resisted any progress toward dressing, and I had to call for my master's assistance in coaxing him out of bed. The poor thing was finally got off with several delusive assurances that his absence would be short, that Mr. Edgar and Cathy would visit him, and other promises, equally ill-founded, which I invented and reiterated at intervals throughout the way. The pure heather-scented air and the bright sunshine and the gentle canter of Minnie relieved his despondency after a while. He began to put questions concerning his new home and its inhabitants with greater interest and liveliness. "Is Wuthering Heights as pleasant a place as Thrushcross Grange?" he inquired, turning to take a last glance into the valley, whence a light mist mounted and formed a fleecy cloud on the skirts of the blue. "It is not so buried in trees," I replied, "and it is not quite so large, but you can see the country beautifully all round, and the air is healthier for you, fresher and drier. You will perhaps think the building old and dark at first, though it is a respectable house, the next best in the neighborhood, and you will have such nice rambles on the moors. Hareton Earnshaw, that is Miss Cathy's other cousin, and so yours in a manner, will show you all the sweetest spots, and you can bring a book in fine weather and make a green hollow your study, and now and then your uncle may join you in a walk. He does frequently walk out on the hills." "And what is my father like?" he asked. "Is he as young and handsome as uncle?" "He's as young," said I, "but he has black hair and eyes, and looks sterner, and he is taller and bigger altogether. He'll not seem to you so gentle and kind at first, perhaps, because it is not his way. Still, mind you be frank and cordial with him, and naturally he'll be fonder of you than any uncle, for you are his own." "Black hair and eyes," mused Linton. "I can't fancy him. Then I am not much like him, Anna, am I?" "Not much," I answered. Not a morsel, I thought, surveying with regret the white complexion and slim frame of my companion with his large, languid eyes. His mother's eyes, save that, unless a morbid touchiness kindled them a moment, they had not a vestige of her sparkling spirit. "How strange that he should never come to see Mamma, and me," he murmured. "Has he ever seen me? If he have, I must have been a baby. I remember not a single thing about him." "Why, Master Linton," said I, 300 miles is a great distance, and 10 years seem very different in length to a grown-up person, compared with what they do to you. It is probable Mr. Heathcliff proposed going from summer to summer, but never found a convenient opportunity, and now it is too late. Don't trouble him with questions on the subject. It will disturb him for no good." The boy was fully occupied with his own cogitations for the remainder of the ride, till we halted beside the farmhouse garden gate. I watched to catch his impressions in his countenance. He surveyed the carved front and low-browed lattices, the straggling gooseberry bushes and crooked firs, with solemn intentness, and then shook his head. His private feelings entirely disapproved of the exterior of the new abode. But he had sense to postpone complaining. There might be compensation within. Before he dismounted, I went and opened the door. It was 6:30. The family had just finished breakfast. The servant was clearing and wiping down the table. Joseph stood by his master's chair, telling some tale concerning a lame horse, and Hareton was preparing for the hayfield. "Hallo, Nelly," cried Mr. Heathcliff when he saw me. "I feared I should have to come down and fetch my property myself. You've brought it, have you? Let us see what we can make of it." He got up and strode to the door. Hareton and Joseph followed in gaping curiosity. Poor Linton ran a frightened eye over the faces of the three. "Surely," said Joseph after a grave inspection, "he's swapped with ye, master, and yon's his, lass." Heathcliff, having stared his son into an ague of confusion, uttered a scornful laugh. "God, what a beauty! What a lovely, charming thing!" he exclaimed. "Haven't they reared it on snails and sour milk, Nelly? Oh, damn my soul, but that's worse than I expected, and the devil knows I was not sanguine." I bid the trembling and bewildered child get down and enter. He did not thoroughly comprehend the meaning of his father's speech, or whether it were intended for him. Indeed, he was not yet certain that the grim, sneering stranger was his father, but he clung to me with growing trepidation, and on Mr. Heathcliff's taking a seat and bidding him come hither, he hid his face on my shoulder and wept. "Tut, tut," said Heathcliff, stretching out a hand and dragging him roughly between his knees, and then holding up his head by the chin. "None of that nonsense. We're not going to hurt thee, Linton. Isn't that thy name? Thou art thy mother's child entirely. Where is my share in thee, puling chicken?" He took off the boy's cap and pushed back his thick, flaxen curls, felt his slender arms and his small fingers, during which examination Linton ceased crying and lifted his great blue eyes to inspect the inspector. "Do you know me?" asked Heathcliff, having satisfied himself that the limbs were all equally frail and feeble. "No," said Linton, with a gaze of vacant fear. "You've heard of me, I dare say?" "No," he replied again. "No. What a shame of your mother, never to waken your filial regard for me. You are my son, then, I'll tell you, and your mother was a wicked slut to leave you in ignorance of the sort of father you possessed. Now, don't wince and color up, though it is something to see you have not white blood. Be a good lad, and I'll do for you. Nelly, if you be tired, you may sit down. If not, get home again. I guess you'll report what you hear and see to the cipher at the Grange, and this thing won't be settled while you linger about it." "Well," replied I hope you'll be kind to the boy, Mr. Heathcliff, or you'll not keep him long, and he's all you have akin in the wide world that you will ever know. Remember." "I'll be very kind to him, you needn't fear," he said, laughing. "Only nobody else must be kind to him. I'm jealous of monopolizing his affection. And to begin my kindness, Joseph, bring the lad some breakfast. Hareton, you infernal calf, begone to your work. Yes, Nell," he added when they had departed, "my son is prospective owner of your place, and I should not wish him to die till I was certain of being his successor. Besides, he's mine, and I want the triumph of seeing my descendant fairly lord of their estates. My child hiring my child hiring their children to till their father's lands for wages. That is the sole consideration which can make me endure the whelp. I despise him for himself and hate him for the memories he revives. But that consideration is sufficient. He's as safe with me and shall be tended as carefully as your master tends his own. I have a room upstairs furnished for him in handsome style. I have engaged a tutor also to come 3 times a week from 20 miles distance to teach him what he pleases to learn. I've ordered Hareton to obey him, and in fact I've arranged everything with a view to preserve the superior and the gentleman in him above his associates. I do regret, however, that he so little deserves the trouble. If I wished any blessing in the world, it was to find him a worthy object of pride, and I'm bitterly disappointed with the whey-faced, whining wretch. While he was speaking, Joseph returned, bearing a basin of milk porridge, and placed it before Linton. He stirred round the homely mess with a look of aversion, and affirmed he could not eat it. I saw the old manservant shared largely in his master's scorn of the child, though he was compelled to retain the sentiment in his heart, because Heathcliff plainly meant his underlings to hold him in honour. "Cannot ate it," repeated he, peering in Linton's face, and subduing his voice to a whisper for fear of being overheard. "But Maister Hareton niver ate nowt else when he were a little un. And what were good enough for him's good enough for ya, I's rather think." "I shan't eat it," answered Linton snappishly. "Take it away." Joseph snatched up the food indignantly and brought it to us. "Is there aught ails the victuals?" he asked, thrusting the tray under Heathcliff's nose. "What should ail them?" he said. "Wah!" answered Joseph. "Yon dainty chap says he cannot eat them, but I guess it's right. His mother were just so. We were almost too mucky to sow to corn for mecking her bread." "Don't mention his mother to me," said the master angrily. "Get him something that he can eat, that's all. What is his usual food, Nellie?" I suggested boiled milk or tea, and the housekeeper received instructions to prepare some. Come, I reflected, his father's selfishness may contribute to his comfort. He perceives his delicate constitution and the necessity of treating him tolerably. I'll console Mr. Edgar by acquainting him with the turn Heathcliff's humour has taken. Having no excuse for lingering longer, I slipped out, while Linton was engaged in timidly rebuffing the advances of a friendly sheepdog. But he was too much on the alert to be cheated. As I closed the door, I heard a cry and a frantic repetition of the words, "Don't leave me! I'll not stay here! I'll not stay here!" Then the latch was raised and fell. They did not suffer him to come forth. I mounted Minnie and urged her to a trot, and so my brief guardianship ended. That concludes today's reading from Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. We'll continue tomorrow with just 1 chapter, but I peeked ahead a little bit. It's a really good chapter. Okay, so I hope you have a great rest of your day. And again, if you have not yet RSVP'd for the Count of Monte Cristo tea, but you would like to go, please RSVP is going. That way I can send you your tea. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow for more reading, and maybe I'll see you next Friday for shared tea time. Bye, friends.